Welcome everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's an honour, as always, to be here gathered on Bunurong lands, the home of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And it always is making me think lately about my own ancestry and my own legacy and what brings me here today. And I also wanted to thank Work Club Global for helping us put tonight's event on. It's a really important conversation and it's a really special thing to be able to be here in a room with Frances, who's been talking with MPs and very important people for the last few days. So it's really precious to have this time, so thank you. I'm arriving in the context of what's going on in the world. I know that everyone's feeling very affected by the conflict in Israel and Palestine in the last few days, and it shakes up the foundation of our own feelings of safety and peace and global world order. We're watching things kind of cascade around us across multiple things. So I actually was hoping everyone would be open to just a few minutes of catching our breath, turning off our phones, and maybe if you're a meditator, closing our eyes and grounding our feet and just arriving here together. I've spent a lot of today in contemplation, not on social media, which is poignant given the person we're about to talk to. And I'm very emotional tonight, so if I cry, it's all good. And I just thought when we close our eyes now for a couple of minutes and take some deep breaths and regulate our nervous systems, we might also just send out a blessing of peace into the world. You just return to your body, to the space. I feel like we could have all dropped in then for a couple of hours, but a few breaths sometimes does the trick. And we are incredibly honoured and privileged. I'm going to read from my computer for this, to have the remarkable Frances Haugen here with us tonight. We interviewed Frances for the Dumbo Feather podcast. So if you want to hear that conversation, that was our first sort of introduction to you and your incredible work. And Frances is kind of called the Facebook whistleblower, but she's much, much more than that. Frances is an advocate for accountability and transparency in social media. Frances holds a degree in electrical and computer engineering from Olin College and an MBA from Harvard University. She's a specialist in algorithmic product management, having worked on ranking algorithms at Google, Pinterest, Yelp, and Facebook. In 2019, she was recruited to Facebook to be the lead product manager on the civic misinformation team, which dealt with issues related to democracy and misinformation, and later also worked on counter-espionage. During her time at Facebook, Frances became increasingly alarmed by the choices the company makes, prioritising their own profits over public safety and putting people's lives at risk. As a last resort and at great personal risk, Frances made the courageous decision to blow the whistle on Facebook. The initial reporting was done by the Wall Street Journal in what became known as the Facebook Files. Since going public, Frances has testified in front of the US Congress, UK and EU parliaments, the French Senate and National Assembly, and has engaged with lawmakers internationally on how to best address the negative externalities of social media platforms. Welcome, Frances Haugen.
Happy to be here.
So we just had a long-ranging, broad, deep, juicy, beautiful conversation in my office before, and I'd love to give everyone a bit of a taste of that. And we'll speak for about 35, 40 minutes and then open to questions. So please keep your questions live for Frances, and if you want more time, we can take more time. I think it would be amazing if you could just give us some context on what you did at Facebook and why.
Sure. So when I first was approached by Facebook to work on civic misinformation, I definitely made a career mistake, which was I assumed I understood what the job was, and I did not ask enough questions. I was like, oh, it's 2019, civic misinformation. This is clearly like gearing up for the 2020 US election. Like, I know what this job is going to be, like, totally. And I get there and I get completely blindsided because the scope of what I'm supposed to work on is misinformation that is outside the kind of catchment area of the current third-party fact-checking program. Now, at the time, third-party fact-checking, that's where Facebook pays journalists to go and fact-check a handful of articles, maybe hundreds a month globally, is largely focused on only a couple of markets. So it's, covers a good deal of Western Europe. It covers some in Australia today. And now they do have fact checkers in India. They have some that are kind of like pan Africa, though like very, very thinly so. And then largely the United States, at least back then. And they said, so the rest of the world, though, like all these situations where there are no fact checkers on the ground, which is also the places where misinformation doesn't cause like fights at dinner, it causes like ethnic violence. You're going to cover it there, and anywhere there is fact checking, you're going to cover it in times of crisis. So like if there's a bombing and like they're going to like go storm a mosque or a temple as a result, like also that's your responsibility. And as someone, I'm very, very empathetic to all the people who worked at Facebook before me who didn't sit there and think about how their product might be hurting people. Because until I sat there and had to confront that job, I had not thought about social media hurting people. Like I had seen misinformation in the 2016 election, but I hadn't thought, oh, this is going to lead to genocide. And what became very, very apparent to me was Facebook had made a series of business decisions to prevent competitors from emerging, where they said, hey, we're going to go into some of the most fragile places in the world and tell people, hey, if you use Facebook, we will pay for your data. And remember, back in 2015, 2016, 2017, it might be $65, $150 for a gigabyte of data in many countries in Africa or Southeast Asia. In countries where someone's their monthly wage might be $200, right? A few megabytes meant a lot to people. So they came in and said, if you use Facebook's products, your data is free. If you use anything else on the open web, you're going to pay for it yourself. And people began to converge onto Facebook because it was the common denominator. Like as a business, you could have your own web page or you could have a Facebook page. Everyone could access your Facebook page. But those markets also made Facebook very little money. And Facebook started telling the world very early on, the path to safety is content moderation. We're going to take down the dangerous things, kind of clean it up after the fact. But what they didn't tell people was when we focus on content, we have to rebuild those systems for every language. And there's 4,000 or 5,000 languages in the world. The places in the world that are the most fragile are often the most linguistically diverse, and they often speak smaller peripheral languages, the same kind of languages that are not supported by Facebook. When I joined Facebook, there had been one large-scale ethnic violence incident, which had been Myanmar. The UN had come out maybe 6 months before I joined and with a 250-page report saying this was Facebook's fault. Here's all the reasons why. By the time I left, there'd been a second incident in Ethiopia. And I think Ethiopia is a really great illustration of why we have to start thinking about other kinds of strategies for safety, like safety by design, because there's like 105 million people in Ethiopia. There's 6 major language families. There's 95 dialects. That's a lot of languages to cover. And when people started getting shot in Ethiopia, Facebook had any safety systems. When I say any, I mean like maybe a violence incitement one and a hate speech one in 2 of the 6 language families. I don't know how many dialects they covered, probably 2 dialects. And so it's one of these things where I saw that there weren't a lot of people who would be able to explain this to the world, and that we should not expect these instances to be the whole story. They were really just opening chapters of a dystopian book that we didn't want to read the end of.
Were you the only person
They could see
that could see this, that was reading between the lines?
I don't think so. So when I showed up at Facebook, so I'm a PTSD survivor from when I got really sick in my late 20s, and I showed up at Facebook, and it was very weird for me because I showed up and like anyone who had been there for like more than 6 months or so, 9 months, had like a really flat affect.
Huh.
And I was like, whoa, this is weird. Like I've worked at other tech companies. Like people say tech people are kind of like wooden. No, this is something else. And I would talk to people about it, and I would like kind of get the vibe. And there were a lot of people walking around who very obviously had either PTSD or like a moral injury. Like
a moral injury.
Have you heard of moral injury?
Say more.
So moral injury is a psychological term that came out of Vietnam, where soldiers that witnessed actions that were against their own moral code, like what they thought was right or wrong, came out of it with things that look like PTSD symptoms. And we see it a lot today with, say, medical professionals, where they spend years learning how to heal people. And in the United States, like we don't have universal health care. And they, these doctors, these nurses, they watch people suffer and die for totally preventable conditions because they don't have health insurance. And so I walked around and we were operating in a context where every day we were assigned to go try to understand what was actually happening on the platform and told, you need to make this better. But within a context where, we weren't allowed to do anything that ever moved profit down by 0.1%. There are documents in the disclosures that talk about how much is 10% misinformation worth in profit. Is it worth 0.1%? Is it worth 1%? What about 30% less misinformation? Is that worth 0.1%? Because there wasn't any kind of space. There wasn't a framework for saying this is actually worth the trade-off, because that is a subjective opinion. And Facebook really devalued that kind of responsibility or leadership. I know, it's a lot. I promised to end on a happier, I won't say happy note, but happier note. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that the people who are in this room and the work that we do in this building is about really understanding and lifting the lid on what is going on, what is happening in these systems that we are living within, not least of which is the AI system we're living in. This is a system we're living in now, and we are actually wayfinding via these things.
Yep.
And we're fucked if we do that and don't actually start to acknowledge that the climate and the ecological crisis is it's a bellwether. It's telling us that this system is broken. We need to actually attend.
Yeah.
We need to attend only if we have the information of what is going on. What have we designed? What have we done? And how do we repair these things that we've done? So to go back to that point in your story, so you're walking around, you're noticing moral injury, which is an incredible term. And
so I'll give you an example. Like we did not, as a larger team, get happy hour every week, but the social cohesion team did.
Get happier?
Happy hour.
Get happy hour.
Yeah. So like they would buy drinks and like food. So the social cohesion team worked on things like societal violence, because like violence happens when social cohesion breaks down. And so you don't have to write in like notes or in documents, the genocide team says. You say the social cohesion team says, right? Like the product manager, the person who had my job on that team, we would go for long walks together. So Facebook has a beautiful green roof. It's like one of my favorite things about that office. And I would go for walks with him up there because like I have no trouble because I am a PTSD survivor. I don't put judgment on if you are experiencing depression or like heavy feelings because you're wrestling with like people's lives every day with not enough resources. But I would walk in, I would see them in the conference room, and it was just such absurdity to me because like here were these like maybe 10 people who are being told, there's 4,000 to 5,000 languages in the world. We know that when there's a lot of hate speech spread online, like there's some very beautiful studies now where like in Germany, they have extensive laws against hate speech, violence incitement. They passed a law a couple of years ago where they said if it's illegal offline, like if you had printed it in a magazine, it would have been illegal. It's illegal online. And and you can see the graph. Hate speech online fell, and violence against immigrants fell at the same time, right? Language has an impact. So imagine you're on a team and you're told, hey, you need to figure out how to take this system, which the way we've architected it today, this content censorship, this content moderation system that is not meant to be in 4,000 languages. Like economically, doesn't have budget allocated for it. Like we don't have a way of scaling within our current context to do that. I think there are ways to do that, but they weren't moving that direction. Oh, by the way, like you 10 people, you're now responsible for trying to prevent those people from dying. Like that's an almost impossible burden. And so to watch them, in a conference room with like 2 bottles of Prosecco and some beers, you're like we're committing violence against the people in that room by having them struggle in that way. And I just felt those kinds of things were never acknowledged.
So how long were you at Facebook before you decided, I have to lift the lid on this, I need to do something?
So I started having thoughts on it as early as like the Iowa caucuses, just because I saw things where I was like, this is really negligent. But then this thing called COVID happened. And so I had a meeting with a friend who was like the chief lawyer for a startup, and I'd asked him a bunch of questions. And then I had gone home like a week later, and my father is a virologist. So he studies human papillomavirus. So he's a wart doctor. And so I was reading about this virus, and I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a huge deal. And so chaos ensued for a couple months, and I moved in with my parents. And that summer, I'm really grateful that series of events happened because I was only able to recover from kind of going through that process of awakening. Like a lot of whistleblowers are in really bad shape when they come forward because holding a secret that you think is going to hurt other people is really painful, right? Like having to become confident when everyone around you is trying to justify why this thing is happening, that you are not crazy, is really hard. And when I moved in with my parents, like, they both have PhDs. My mother is like as eclectically read as I am. Like my dad's not a slouch either. And like we would sit and have conversations about it.
Okay.
Right? Like I didn't have to do that suffering.
You were sense checking.
Yeah, I was sense checking.
Yeah.
And so by the time they dissolved the Civic Integrity Organization, so this was the part of Facebook they founded post 2016 election, when Facebook got slammed for like not doing a whole bunch of really obvious things. Like we can talk about some of those, but just read my memoir, The Power of One, if you want more context there. But when they dissolved our team, I was like, this is Facebook giving up, right? Like when I got my MBA at Harvard, I took a class in change management, which sounds like a bullshit MBA thing. You're like, you want to be a consultant when you grow up, do you? But it's actually like a fascinating field of study because think of how hard it is for us to change even one habit, right? Once you get a bunch of us together who have like vested interests in how we're doing things now, it's really hard to get people to shift. And one of the things that you don't really have the option of doing, you have to do if you want to get an organization to change, is you have to appoint a vanguard and say, this group of people is doing it the way we're all going to end up doing it.
If that's annoying you, you can move it.
I'm okay. Yeah, we're good. Where we're all going to go that way. You're either going to get with them and go along, or we're going to protect them. Like you need to watch it. And Facebook did that for 4 years. The only part of Facebook Blue that was growing for at least the last 2 years I was there was civic integrity, or like up until the point they dissolved this, I should say. And so when they dissolved civic integrity, which happened less than 30 days after the election, like you could tell they were like, check, no blood on the streets, success. And they dissolved this. And unfortunately, this thing called January 6th happened a couple weeks after that. And kind of watching those things in concert, where it was like, oh, like you've given up. You're actually not willing to try anymore. And because no one was now responsible, like no one could call the war room, no one could turn back on the safety mechanisms that were on for the election. Stop the Steal grew explosively, and in ways that should have been entirely predictable, right? So a little nuance that's not obvious from the outside. If you are invited to a Facebook group, they treat it as an ad, like they accepted that invitation for 30 days. So you're going to start getting stuff into your feed, even though you never consented to it. You never asked for it. And if you engage with any of it, you write a comment and say, this is misinformation, they're going to say, oh, you like it, and put you in that group. And in the case of Stop the Steal, a very small number of people added thousands and thousands and thousands of people to these groups. Like the top inviter invited 330,000 people to Stop the Steal groups. And no one at Facebook was responsible during that time period for holding up their hand and saying, we have a crisis on our hands.
So Frances Haugen is at home with her parents, sense checking that something's really wrong. I think it's important to walk it out. Like, what did you do?
What did I do? So I happened to have just gone back to San Francisco, like a week before they dissolved the team. So I've been at home with my parents for 6 months. I'm feeling a lot more like a whole person. This thing happens, and I, like many disgruntled employees, I open LinkedIn to see, I wonder who would want to hire me. And I look at my messages, and I have this message from like 2 weeks earlier from Jeff Horowitz. And he says, like, hey, like, I know it's lots going on right now. Like, I was wondering, like, how did the election go? Like, would any of these measures make sense in the future? And I reached out to him, and I was like, how do I know you are who you say you are?
Tell everyone who he is.
Oh, Jeff Horowitz is the journalist for the Wall Street Journal who did the Facebook files. But before that moment, he, I think, had done some of the best journalism on the violence caused by Facebook in India. And so I knew that he cared about international violence. But there were a lot of people who saw Facebook only as English speakers see Facebook, or American English speakers see Facebook, which is like the cleanest, most gardened, most groomed version of Facebook. And he had done a lot of serious digging around how Facebook's products had really enabled the rise of extremism in India. So he reached out, and we went for a hike in the Oakland Hills because, nature gives you clarity. And the rest is history.
Wow, it's extraordinary. I know that there are people in this room who are really fatigued. They're really sort of broken by the system being so intransigent. And we are, so I don't want to gloss over that. That's extraordinary. I know you say it's like a footnote, and the rest is history. That because of what you did, you tanked Facebook's share market price by how much? 75%
at the low point. Yeah. So my husband always likes to make the joke, like, you didn't stand up to $1 trillion company. You only stood up to a $250 billion.
I want to talk about, I think this is a thing a lot of people don't know about you, and I'm completely fascinated by moral ecologies, how people like you are created. Because it takes, you would use words like takes a lot of bravery. It takes a lot of all these things. But I think that you come from a legacy that's quite extraordinary and a moral ecology that's very particular. So what gave you the moral courage to do the right thing when everything in the system was saying computer says no?
So I think part of where I had like some very distinct advantages are like I went to a brand new college called Olin. So Olin is a lab school. So it's like an educational institution that exists to find new ways to teach engineering. And they had a lot more spaces in their curriculum for things beyond engineering. So like one of the challenges with engineering curriculums is I really don't think they should let people graduate with engineering degrees in less than 5 years. And that's like a really, in the United States, college takes 4 years usually. So I don't know if you're a 3-year university place or a 4-year university place. But in the US, and it's you remember, college isn't free. A lot of universities that have engineering programs waive your general education requirements because they're like, oh, you have to do all this technical study. Like, you don't have space
to develop you as a human being.
Yeah. I feel really grateful that when I was in high school, I was really profoundly bored. So I grew up in Iowa. My parents are both professors. They're from Berkeley and New York City, and they met in the middle. They like to say, I'm regression to the mean. My dad, my junior year in high school, said I didn't have to go to any school I didn't want to go to because I got caught excusing myself from school. And so I did a lot of time on debate. So we had a debate program. It was like a nationally traveling program. I traveled like 17 weekends my senior year for debate. And so I had spent a lot of time in like the university library thinking about why do we know what we know, what matters, that kind of thing. And so between that time plus the time in college where like I coached debate, combined with having a little bit more space, like not even a ton more space, but a little bit more space in my schedule to like study history. So like I'm a Cold War Studies minor. It meant that I had...
You said that really quickly, but I actually really want everyone to hear that we've had the most wide-ranging, outrageous conversation. You minored in Cold War studies, specifically focusing on civil disobedience.
That was my thesis. So we had to do like a capstone project. Yeah.
And it was civil disobedience against civil defense.
Yeah.
Which is a remarkable topic, which I'd love you to talk about more. Sure. But keep going because there's also a religious context.
Yeah. So the story of the Cold War, I think, is I really feel like this period of time, like we reduce it down to there were like nukes and like people died. Oh, and Vietnam happened. Oh, and then the Cold War, and then the wall fell. Because a lot of amazing things just changed in the world, right? Like think about this for a second. Like when people get really despondent about how like we're doomed, I want you to take a step back and be like, in 1900, how many people in the world thought the British were going to leave India? Like contemplate that. Like in 1880, there was like 72 people in the world who were like, the British will leave India. Like the first Indian National Congress. Like, we got this. It's going to take a while, but it's going to happen. Or like apartheid ended. Or like the Soviet Union fell. No one in the world in 1960 thought these things were possible. And part of what I find so beautiful about like having that depth and that anchor, like that idea that there are truly cruel, huge, oppressive organizations in the world, and enduring and remaining a human being and having hope and like caring for each other, that is like how the world changes. And for the thesis that I was talking about, so I had found this article I was in a seminar on the history of the family. Super interesting topic. We take all kinds of things for granted. Things have been very different at very different times in history. But and I did a paper, just my final paper on like Cold War families, like 1950s, some nuclear stuff. And I found this article that was on the civil disobedience protests against these simulations of nuclear war the United States used to do. Like, imagine living in a country where once a year, who here knows what LARPing is? Okay, so in the United States, there's this thing called live action role playing. So people will come out and be like, I am a pirate, you are a pirate, we have foam swords, we are going to fight each other, right? That's LARPing. It's a very nerdy thing, but like if you were in the United States, people are like, I know what LARPing is. LARPers are very lame. But so imagine for a second, we all got together and we were like, once a year for 15 minutes, we're gonna pretend the nuclear holocaust is upon us. Doesn't that sound fun, right? And so we used to do this every single year in the United States. And if you didn't cooperate, like if you didn't take shelter, if you didn't follow orders, you got fined, right? Crazy. So we started this in 1955. A few groups of people, like the Quakers, the Catholic workers, which are like pacifists, Catholics, the socialists, come out and they're like, this is crazy. Nuclear weapons are only going to kill us all. We should not pretend we're going to survive. Like, let's not make this acceptable. And they got totally destroyed, right? Like, these people showed up every year and the police just beat them. Dorothy Day got her arm broken in some of these, that kind of thing. But in 1959, this woman named Mary Charmant had a baby, right? And so part of why also I'm always like, hey, the world changes. This woman has this baby. And remember, back in the 1950s, people had kids younger. She's like 19 years old. Like she's a teenager. She has this baby and she's like, oh my goodness, like I'm gonna have to raise this child in this world. Like I don't want to raise them underground. I don't want to raise them to hate other people. I cannot any longer cooperate with this system. And so she gives the baby to her husband. She gets some bail money. She cooks a roast and leaves it in the oven because, God forbid he has to feed himself, right? If she goes to jail. And she goes out and she sits on this bench near like the civil defense van that's near her and waits for the sirens to go off. And the sirens go off and everyone in New York City disappears. Like the photos of this time period are otherworldly because like everything's gone. And the civil defense people get really mad at her because she's just like hanging on this bench and they get the police to come over and the police are like, we don't care. And the sirens go off and it's really anticlimactic for her. She thought she was going to jail. Like these other people were in the newspaper every year getting beaten up. And so she goes home and she doesn't really know how to like process this. And she opens up the newspaper because remember, newspapers used to come twice a day back in the olden days. And on like the second page is this woman named Janice Smith. Janice Smith had not done it on some random street in New York. She had gone to City Hall, which is like where the Quakers used to get beaten up. And she had sat on a bench, all dressed up, nice, proper, 1950s young mother with her baby in her arms, toddlers standing on the bench. There's like a police officer looming over her. And Mary looks at this photo and it's like life-changing because she's not the only crazy one. She had been living with like, am I the only one who thinks this is madness? Like I don't have anyone else. And just this like spark of connection, this idea that like someone else also thinks this is completely unacceptable is so transformative that she calls through all the Smiths in the New York City phone book till she finds Janice. Like I looked up the numbers. There's somewhere between 50 and 60,000 Smiths in New York City during this time period, right? And the two of them find two other women who had done the same thing in Queens. The next year there's like 100 women. The year after that there's like 2,000 women. There's a bunch of other cities up and down the East Coast. A whole bunch of people get arrested. But because these women weaponized their motherhood, like the police literally had quotes in this paper saying, so do you take the baby and then beat her? Right? Or there were some men who came and participated and they would hand their babies to these men to protect them. Right? They said, we do not want to live in this world. And so I was like, I'm gonna do my thesis on this. I'm gonna like go to Abilene, Texas, and I'm like read the Eisenhower archives. I'm gonna go to like the Kennedy archive and like check it out. And I can't.
So she's not just a Facebook whistleblower. We're gathering.
I'm a nerd.
Here.
I'm a nerd.
She's a nerd, and
Yeah.
I'll also put in here that your great grandfather wrote the Law of War
Between belligerents. Yeah, it was like the legal book on war in like 1908.
at the Treaty of Versailles.
He worked on the Treaty of Versailles, but that's like 10 years But I'm gonna finish my story real quick. So, but the thing though is, so these women, so there's no word of this. There's no word in the archives about these women. And I was like, oh my goodness, like the real reason why this ended is because we invented like hydrogen bombs and no one was going to survive. Like I read the simulation reports and they're just like, everyone's dead. But these women didn't know that. All they knew was when they came together, the thing ended. And those women ended up being hugely influential in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. They ended up working on the bunch of the Vietnam protests. They became activated because they saw when we lived in the truth, the world changed. And so bringing people together, just bringing them together can be transformative.
And another layer there is that you have a Quaker background. Mm-hmm. Am I right?
Yeah.
So just a little bit of an articulation about what it means to be a Quaker. What are your values?
So Quakers are, it's a Protestant denomination that is pacifist. And pacifism for me, like the way I conceptualize it is, like I believe we can always rationalize violence. Like we can always provide a rationale of like why we have to do violence this time, because we're very clever, we're very creative. And then if you choose to give that up, you will fight every moment before that moment because you've already chosen that sacrifice. So like the story of like Jesus is one of like, he sacrificed for everyone because like he wanted people to live in a different world. If you choose that sacrifice, you say, no, now I'm committed. I'm committed to making sure that moment never happens. Like you can accomplish very different things. And one of the things we talked about earlier was this idea of if you don't believe a problem is solvable, you will not find a solution to a problem, period. And so imagine you came in and said, I have to prevent this conflict from happening because I've already chosen not to participate. Then you're going to figure out how to do it, right?
Yeah. So I was just harvesting text messages earlier from all the mums at one of our children goes to a Jewish school, so we're just harvesting texts about the fact that the principal just said no kids go to in uniform tomorrow because they're driving around looking for Jews to kill. And so we were just having a chat, the mums and I, just going, I don't want to like be alarmist, but are we sending the kids to school tomorrow in Melbourne, Australia? Thank you, Facebook. You can call it Meta, but you can also dress up a pig.
Also, in Hebrew, meta means death. So, what are you going to do?
Yeah, what are you going to do? The Death Star is upon us. And what I'm trying to map here, and I think is so moving about when you talk about Quaker values and you talk about, you have an amazing legacy. Like all of us look into our legacy and go, oh, if you are violent, you're like, oh yeah, but my grandfather was violent. And we can track the arc of where the dysfunction is or where the trauma is or where things went really wrong. But you can also find yourself in your exquisite moments tracking the arc of what is whole and what is healed. Yeah. And
so I think this is one of these things, like part of why I believe in change so much is like, so you mentioned my grandfather, or great grandfather. So he worked on the Treaty of Versailles, and I have no idea, he didn't keep a journal or anything. Like I don't know how he lived with that over time because he was probably in his early 30s when he was a JAG, right? And he was still walking to work and writing papers in his 90s, like law papers. And I've always wondered, like, did it hang with him, right? Like, did it drag him?
The Treaty of Versailles being part of that,
yeah, like a thing that ended that badly, right? His kid, like my mom didn't grow up in a happy home, right? That's his son's home. Or like my mom struggled with a lot of things. I didn't, like we talked about childhoods of trauma. I had a lot of trauma in my childhood. But it's one of these things where we can choose to have different stories. And like for me, like the thing that changed the course of my having a negative life or a not negative life was like when I got so sick in my late 20s, like I had to choose to live, right? And the idea that we choose our lives. Like it's very easy to believe we are just in our lives or we don't have a different future. And like what I went through was so hard that I had to just let it all go and say, do I want to live? Like, what does it mean to live? Right. And so, we live way longer than we ever think about. Or like, I think basically a large fraction of everyone in this room will be alive in 20 years. Like each day when you do what you do, ask yourself, will yourself 20 years from now be happy about how you spent your time? Right? Like for me, people often tell me how brave I was or whatever that I came forward. And like for me, it always felt like I was denied choices, right? That once I knew what I knew, Facebook took my future from me, right? Because if I just slunk off knowing that there were maybe 20 or 30 people who could both communicate and understand the technical systems, it wasn't like I was one of 10,000 people who knew what was going on. It was like there's maybe 20 or 30 people who knew this. If we saw a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth genocide, would I lie in bed in 20 years unable to sleep, right? And so it felt to me like I didn't have a future. So there wasn't anything that I was like risking, so.
Yep. You're amazing. And I think that sometimes when we encounter the good person, we always say bad things happen when good people do nothing. And then when we encounter the good person who did the right thing at the right time and risked it all, put yourself at enormous risk to do it, we look back and I think also people justify
they
why
rationalize.
they rationalize. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, but she was in that, at that time, in that, but all of us are you. All of us
for different
are you.
little things. Yeah, for different little
in
things.
so many different contexts.
Yeah.
And it just is the clarity above the overwhelm.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about the overwhelm earlier as well, and how everyone's exhausted and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed right now, but there's also like tapping into what you were saying before, the somatic experience, and just like being embodied when we do what we do.
So one thing we were talking about earlier was I like to joke that when I got sick, one of the things I found out was that even though I gained like 40 kilograms over like 2 years, I was actually starving to death. Like it's like very counterintuitive. We think starving to death, you're skinny, not like you're fat. And I showed up because I had a clot in my leg, and they did some blood work, and they're like, yeah, your protein, like the things that make our muscles, you can't synthesize it anymore because with celiacs, like celiacs is real, gluten is real, and you can mess up your ability to absorb food. And I was absorbing some things, but not everything. And that meant that I had gone from being able to bike 200 kilometers in a day to be in a wheelchair in 2.5 years. Right. And one of the things that I learned through that experience was like, how do we get up when we fall down? Right. Like when your nerves heal, they hurt like when they get damaged. And so one of the things that I had to learn how to do is figure out, what is my capacity today? Like if you don't have a lot of capacity, how do you get more capacity? You're not failing other people. You're not letting yourself down if you sit and do 2 minutes of quiet. You're recharging. Or like in my case, I have my lovely husband. I'll be like, I need hugs. I need cuddles, right? That doesn't mean you're weak. It means that like that's how we recharge ourselves, and then we get to do bigger things. And I think it's one of these things where most of us take for granted, how do we endure, or how do we keep going? And that when matters, I trained for a year or so to be a Pilates instructor because I really like Pilates. And one of the concepts in Pilates is the most important thing the Pilates instructor can do is get you to come back next time. Because our bodies take so long to change and heal that they want you to appreciate like the experience and what you feel because they need you to come back again. And if we instead have thought about change as like change is going to take longer than we think it is, caring for ourselves along the way, making the journey something that we can continue to do is actually how we change.
Because as you said before, anger burns you out.
Anger burns you out. Yeah. Anger and fear burn you out, and hope and love recharge you.
We can all go home now.
And humor. Humor is great. right? Like the one of the things that, like we were talking about Vladislav Havel earlier, who was the first president of the free Czech Republic.
I think we've got Vladislav on the wall on our inspiration
over
wall.
there. Oh,
we do
good.
Indeed.
Good. And he was a playwright and a poet, and he was really, really funny, right? And then one of the ways that we pull down power, like we take back power, is we laugh, right? We figure out what is the joke, because laughter also recharges us.
So we've just come back, quite a lot of us at Small Giants went on our Small Giants Impact Safari to Scandinavia. We were calling it the Sense-Making Safari, or Sense-Making in the Meta Crisis. And it was a really big trip. It was a lot to process. And one of the things that was incredibly hard was coming back to Australia. Not because it isn't beautiful here and peaceful here and all the things we're grateful for, but it is complacent here because we are so far away from the rest of the world. So what's been surprising for you on this visit, because you've been here before, and some good news that you've observed?
So one of the things that's been really interesting for me, so I've done a lot of these kinds of trips before. So to help kind of get the DSA over the line, I did about 6 weeks in Europe over 3 trips back in 2021 and 2022. And so I've been to Brazil to raise awareness before their election last year. I've done stuff in the United States with state legislatures. So a lot of the mechanics of this, like the kinds of having the same conversation over and over again, none of that was new. But the thing that I was surprised that I could still be shocked by was, I did a bunch of reading on the voice vote because it's I knew it was going to come up in our conversations with MPs and ministers. And one of the things that I was not aware of was a whole bunch of the Indigenous community has been reaching out to Facebook. Indigenous organizations have been reaching out and saying, hey, in the last 3 months, the volume of really vile racial slurs has exploded on Facebook's products. It could be on Instagram, it could be on Facebook, it could be in a comment, it could be in a post. We're not asking you to take down hateful posts. It's very hard to classify, is this hate speech? Is this hate speech? We're asking you for the bare minimum. If there's a really vile slur where the equivalent slur in the United States, say against a Black person or a Latino, would get taken down, please just take it down, right? Real basic bar. Because like we said before, presence of hateful slurs online literally translates into violence. And to give you a little order of magnitude here on the significance of this, there is a mental health line run by the Indigenous for the Indigenous in Australia. And of their 10 heaviest call volume weeks in the entire time they've been open, 3 of them were in the last 5 weeks, right? It's really important. It has really serious consequences. And Meta didn't respond for the last 3 months until Monday. And I don't know if it's because I've been doing press and relaying this anecdote over and over again, or if it finally got bad enough. And the reason why I was surprised is this is actually, I think, a perfect illustration of the core complaint I've been making since my first Senate testimony, which is that when we try to make these systems safe after the fact, instead of designing with safety in mind, we have to re-localize them dialect by dialect, language by language. And I had met with, I got to testify to the UK Parliament. And this MP got up, and this is the first time I really became aware of this issue. He's openly gay, very openly gay, and he told a story about how he had reported a very vile homophobic slur to Twitter, and they said, no, we're not taking that post down, it's not homophobic. And he sent back a response, he sent a link to Urban Dictionary, as one does. They wrote back, I'm so sorry, but this is not on our list of hateful slurs. It shouldn't be surprising that this is repeating again in Australia. But it's one of these things where I forget over and over again, even Australian English and American English, UK English, they're different things. And we just have to keep demanding linguistic equity.
I'm sure you could give us a list of what we're supposed to do when we leave here, but you did say one thing that that Australia has an e-safety commissioner.
Yeah. So one of the things that gives me a lot of optimism about Australia. So we founded last year a nonprofit called Beyond the Screen, because all of us right now are limited to what we see on our own screens. We've got Bryson back there, my co-founder. You can talk to him later. Do you have your voice back yet?
I can talk.
Ooh, he was struggling a couple days ago. That's all I got to say. But the
and they need support.
Yeah.
So that's also, just to be clear.
Yes, that'd be lovely.
If you're interested in that, in the
we
work
can do a lot
that they're
more
doing.
with even a little bit more support. I can travel us for public speaking appearances. It would be delightful. But the part of why we're in Australia, just like we were in Singapore 2 weeks ago, or like why I'm a fellow at McGill, Quebec French Canadian is not the same as Parisian French. Same problems that you guys are having with Australian English. Australia has a history of being willing to move early and incrementally. So back a number of years ago, you guys had a crisis around Twitter where a celebrity committed suicide because she was bullied online. And what could have happened, and probably would have happened in the United States, is we would have had a big moment about it and then not been able to agree and then move on. And what Australia did was really interesting was they said, hey, we're actually having trouble figuring out how to agree on what to do for the whole problem, but we can at least agree that kids need special protections, and we are at least going to start with an e-safety commissioner for like bullying for children or like child exploitative imagery. And what's interesting is once you say yes there, you can begin expanding. And today, the e-safety commissioner is not just like one of the most robust ones in the world. It still could do a lot more. That's okay. We're always working on it. It actually is a leader amongst other independent regulators. So Julie Grant, who's the e-safety commissioner here, helps coordinate, like there's like a coalition of independent internet regulators. And so like there's a bunch of countries around the world now that have these independent regulators because like Australia was the first, right? And so we want to help kind of templatize like what should norms be? Like what are things that we could agree to? And I think the place to start, and which people on the right and the left can almost always agree with, is right now we can't see what we actually consume. Like the version of social media that the people in this room consume is not the same as the version that people 2 miles that way consume, right? Or two states over consume. There's 1,000 different Facebooks in Australia because of how the algorithms push people, because of the interests of different people, socioeconomic backgrounds, languages. Almost everyone on the right and the left can at least agree we should have transparency. And so one of the things I've been counseling the government on is there's a lot of arguments right now about the misinformation bill. And I was like, you should have started way simpler. You should have started with a censorship transparency bill and said, we need to have compulsory powers for the e-regulator that you need to show us your safety systems. You need to show us performance data on your safety systems. You need to show us kind of a larger picture of what's actually happening on these platforms, because it's like ingredient labels on food.
Yeah,
like
and baselines. We were also talking about baselines. So we were saying that each generation gets used to a new baseline.
Totally.
And so the next generation will get used to a baseline without polar bears.
Yeah.
And then they're like, polar bears. Oh, I've seen a picture of polar bears. And we don't want those baselines to shift into a dystopian future for our kids, where the baseline for what they expect for their mental health, social cohesion, civil society, that baseline cannot shift the way it has shifted. And it's shifted because and we've talked about this as well, I'll open to questions now, but it's shifted. We have mammalian brains trying to contextualize this technology.
And we can each only see our own screens.
Frances, we need you. And we need all of us in this room. We're so grateful that you're here. I'm going to open to questions. Sorry.
Bryce's like giving me gestures and I'm not sure what they mean.
I think it's time, because we could keep talking forever, and I'm really curious to know what questions have emerged as we've been talking.
And there's no dumb questions, right? Like our focus of our nonprofit is capacity building across the ecosystem of accountability. And the reality is people in this room are actually part of that ecosystem. So any question you have, don't worry, there's no judgment.
Yes, please.
Artificial intelligence.
Ooh.
Is the part of
Yeah.
AI.
Mm-hmm.
It can obviously be good, used for good, and
Mm-hmm.
how are those two things going to play off in the social media sense?
Ooh, great question.
In my mind,
Yeah.
Facebook would use AI to better tackle all of the negative things that are being posted, but on bad actors, negative terrorist groups, etc., can also use it to just absolutely spam the social media platforms. So how do you sort of see that playing out?
Totally.
Who wins, if anyone?
Yeah. So one of the things I'm always trying to get all of the AI activists, there's certain AI activists who used to be really big about social media accountability or transparency reform. And they're like, oh no, we got bigger problems. We got to deal with AI. And what I always try to remind them is the first battlefield for AI, we don't need Skynet level AI to come kill us all. The AIs we have right now, if you set them loose on social media, they can do that work already, right? You don't need that level of complexity. And so there's a couple of core problems. The first is content moderation. So content moderation right now is done by AIs. It's interesting. I watched a panel where a Facebook representative was on it, which is about the promise and the harm of AI. And they're like, well, AI can do content moderation. And I sat there and being like, oh, because we've known for about 5 years that there's a thing called adversarial AI. So adversarial AI is, we have a picture of a panda. Everyone in the room is like, this is a panda. We're humans, we can recognize it. Here's another image. Everyone in this room, because the way we process sensory imagery, we're like, that is a panda. They're the same picture. In reality, this image has had a few pixels twiddled, changed. Kind of like how generative AI works, where it's going to keep slightly changing the texture until the AI says, oh, that's a monkey. And the consequence of this on a social media platform is, let's say the thing you're trying to identify is violence inciting content or hateful content, inflammatory content. If you can go in there and change a few words, put some commas in some spaces, and the post basically says exactly the same thing, but now the AI is like, oh, that's fine. And part of why we have to have transparency on these censorship systems is we have to be able to spot that, right? Right now, we have no idea if large state actors are already doing this, right? They know when their stuff gets taken down, they can use those posts to train one of these systems. That opens up an opportunity. So a big part of what we evangelize on is how we do safety through design instead of safety through content. So this is things like, should you have to click on a link before you reshare it? It sounds really simple, but you get 10 or 15% less misinformation for free when you require someone to stop and actually consume that content before they share it. Or things like a huge fraction of all the misinformation comes from really long chains of reshares. This is why on WhatsApp, which can't view the content today, they cut those reshare chains at 5. Research has been done at Facebook where they say, hey, let's imagine we cut those chains on Facebook at 2. We say once it's beyond friends of friends, there's not enough context cues anymore. You can say anything you want. We can respect freedom of speech, but you have to choose to. You have to copy and paste that post and put it in a search box, in the post box. Take responsibility for posting it and not just hit reflexively reshare. And that little change has the same impact on misinformation that the whole third-party fact-checking program does. Only it works in every language for free. And there's lots of these things. There's lots and lots of these things. And so I think we should be using this moment of crisis. Because remember, what you were talking about, the spamming thing, that's also a viral variant thing. They can go and make 1,000 different versions of something to figure out exactly what meme is most inspiring. This should be used as an opportunity to say, hey, let's actually we need to hold these platforms by the hand a little bit and say, we're going to hold you accountable to actually make sure you're ready for this change.
Any other questions?
I would say one more thing. Sorry. One more thing.
Do it.
And I think there's lessons we can learn from social media on how do we progress. So our big 2 things are transparency and incentives, right? When it comes to AI, there should be a right of saying, hey, if you are developing a large model, you have to at least register it so we know it's around. And you need to give researchers who request access free access. And the reason for this is, one of the ways that we want to extend our current project, which is around developing like harm taxonomies and like solution taxonomies, is, we want to extend that in the near future, maybe 6 months or a year, to include scenarios. We can have AIs talk to AIs. Like an AI should not encourage a child to hide their 21-year-old boyfriend, right? But AIs do that today. They'll give kids advice on like how to sneak out with their 25-year-old boyfriend, right? We should begin making taxonomies where we can extend and say, let's check. We don't have the right today, though, to have that access. The second is incentives. Imagine if all the big corporations in Australia and the United States said, hey, we're going to be investing $1 trillion in developing these AIs in the next couple of years, or spending on services. Like the estimates for the size of the generative AI market by like 2030 is something like $15 trillion globally. If they came out and said, we will only give those dollars to companies that follow a certain level of safety, we stop some of the race to the bottom that we're seeing right now, right? Facebook should not be allowed to make money off their generative AI because they've done too many irresponsible things already. But we're not going to get those kinds of actions if we don't stop the cycle of seeing people who move fast and break things are going to make the most money.
Amen. Anna.
Thank you so much. That was such a boss. I'm thinking about sort of young people and our receptive brain time and empowering young people to reclaim their attention and just how where our attention goes, our energy flows. And I was wondering really simply what you think your personal practices would be. Like, for example, you could put into schools or young people's curriculums or just advice to us and that we could share with our friends. Totally. Practices to how safely use, if there's a safe way to use social media.
It's interesting. So I include in the scope of social media things like YouTube. And one of the things that I realized really recently, maybe the last 2 months, was that if during the day when I took a break, I watched YouTube, I came away feeling more anxious because everything's short, right? And like they do videos at like really high intensity because they don't want you to like go somewhere else. If I even chose to watch a long form content thing, so there's like, I don't know, a couple of like kind of, I won't say they're like high art dramas, like schlocky TV series that I'll, watch like maybe one episode over the course of 2 days, like all those like 10-minute breaks that I did YouTube. And I'm very slowly moving through Netflix on some of these things, right? Even just doing harm reduction actually adds up. Or like saying, hey, like actually make a practice of looking at your phone and it'll tell you how much time you spend on each app. Ask yourself, like multiply those minutes out in the year. Do you want to look back at the end of the year and say, I spent 1,000 hours on YouTube, right? Or I spent 1,000 hours on TikTok. And usually when people like think about it at that scale, they're like, oh, I want to do something different. I'm really, really, really lucky because I live in an incredibly beautiful place. So I moved to Puerto Rico during COVID. And I spent a lot of time like staring out the window because we look out on the ocean and it's delightful. Or I really like being in water. Like I think people don't spend enough time soaking. So bathtubs are great. But even things as simple as like if you don't have a bathtub, heated blankets, like you can get a really cheap electrical blanket. And just being mindful of the fact that when you're warm and cozy, you feel more relaxed. Little things like that give you incremental energy. And I've had to learn those skills because when your nerves heal, they hurt like when they get damaged. And I went through periods of years where like it felt like I was on fire all the time. But if we sat down and taught kids, like your life is stressful, things are scary, here's like a bunch of different things. Some of them may be compelling to you, some of them may not be. But taking care of yourself and being kind to yourself isn't weakness, it's actually where strength comes from.
Thank you. I'd just be fascinated about your experiences and your feelings about
Yeah.
Is there a different vibe when you're speaking to Australian politicians in the UK and particularly the US? I don't want to cast aspersions, but it just seems very dysfunctional there in the US at the moment. So,
So we don't even have a regulator in the United States, so I can't say that I've talked to a U.S. regulator. I think we are in the beginning stages of a constitutional crisis. I'm willing to take a look at the arc of history and say that's where we stand. If you look at historically, when did we last need 15 ballots to elect a Speaker of the House, of which we don't have one right now? It was the last time. The only times we've ever needed more ballots than that were right before the Civil War, right? It's really serious right now in the United States, and we could talk about that for 20 minutes, but I don't want to go off the rails. I'm really happy with how the European Union has engaged with this, and I think the reason why they've done that is they have paid way higher costs than anyone in this room's paid, or the United States has paid, because Facebook knows that they're an American company and that they need to keep the US English version of Facebook clean. If they want people to perceive it as innocuous, so they don't do anything. In Europe, there's 27 languages spoken in the European Parliament. Even if we were to say, half of those languages are supported by Facebook, or 20 of the 27 are supported by Facebook, or even all of them are supported by Facebook, they don't all have all the safety systems. So, for example, Norway is not technically a member state, but it's in the economic community. I spoke with a journalist from there about how they had found a network of accounts on Instagram that were glorifying suicide. So it was young women, teenagers that were celebrating suicide. So it's black and white picture of train tracks, and today is a great day to die. Right, stuff that very clearly violates Facebook's self-harm policies, but it was in Norwegian. And they brought to Facebook's employee in Norway and said, hey, here's 1,000 posts. We printed them out for you. What's the deal? And the person was like, I can't do anything with these. You have to go report those posts if we want to take them down. So they went and reported them, put them on the spreadsheet, came back a month later. They're all still up. And I'm assuming what happened was there's only 5 to 7 million Norwegian speakers in the world. I think they said there's not enough people here to justify someone who's going to actually check these things. Norwegian's not the only language like that in Europe. Even when you look at larger languages like Italian, I bet Facebook didn't build out all the safety systems that were in English. And so they are really practical. They've put a lot of effort into it, a lot of energy. Other places are beginning to move. So Canada has also put a lot of effort into it. And I kind of wonder if that's because, a good chunk of Canadians speak French as their primary language. And they speak French that doesn't get very good support in French Canadian. I'm really excited about where Singapore is going. So Singapore they're very early in the process, but they want to learn a lot more, and that I feel from talking to a lot of their folks that they seem serious. And then when it comes to Australia, I think there is a desire to build on what you guys have, but we need to learn from what the playbook has been so far in Canada or the European or in the UK in terms of how Facebook has fought back. So Facebook will call any piece of internet regulation a censorship law. And so we have to be really careful about when we're picking out those layers, figuring out what's the things we can all agree on. Instead of starting with giving enforcement powers to ACMA to force companies to enforce their own misinformation policies, which unfortunately, basically all the press coverage has come out and said, this is very dangerous, it's going to lead to censorship. Coming out and saying, hey, we should at least know what's being taken down. We're talking about the AI and how the AI is going to break everything. At a minimum, we should get to see how these things are working. Everyone on the political spectrum agrees with that. And so we need to find those layers, get more transparency. As the curtains open, we get more outrage, and we're willing to do more. And we need to think a little bit more a couple steps down the road, because the tech companies are thinking about how to block these things in that way.
I love it. It's all a question of design. We've got time for one more question. Yeah. Please, from our audience.
Everyone's being too considerate.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, you first.
We can do it together.
Yeah. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
I'm trying to find a way to sort of set up a premise and then listen to
Yeah.
feedback. And the premise is made out of some ideas that I think are related, but I'm not sure how. So the first one is this idea that Alvin Toffler has written The Future Shock in 1974.
Mm-hmm.
We're at the point where we don't have the brain to digest the amount of information that's coming our way. The second part of it is that I'm originally from Israel, and I've been trying to follow what's going on before this incredible catastrophe on the weekend, but the whole judicial reform thing. And I figured out that the best way to do it was, instead of trying to follow the news, which I was doing for a while, is to go to Twitter and pick and choose who I want to follow from all the different sides of the debate to see if I can get an understanding of how these people think versus these people, etc. And what I've learned from that is that most people will just not change their mind about anything pretty much, because they're in that echo chambers that we talk about anyway. But it's not just that. There is something to do with the way that your identity has become meshed in with the stuff that you are connecting with online. And the premise is, I'm looking at what's going on in democracies around the world, and it's clearly some sort of a crisis, regardless of the narrative, regardless of the occasion. And I'm kind of wondering whether the acceleration of those two factors through social media is actually tightly connected to the fact that our democratic system is too fragile to handle the level of regulation that needs to come in order for us to moderate it so it doesn't damage itself.
Yeah. So, because I come from a failed state, I think about a lot of ways to do solutions where the government doesn't have to do them, right? Because I don't have a lot of hope that the United States is going to pass an online regulator anytime soon. And so I think a lot about how do we do things at scale, or what are the laws that we pass that allow us to get to the point where other people can do the work, right? So if we were talking about any other similarly powerful industry, it's not just the government that keeps us safe. It's litigators that go and do personal injury lawsuits. It's investors that want to manage risk. It's concerned citizens that go and do protests or talk to advertisers and organize advertiser boycotts or divestment campaigns. All those things need genuine information in order to happen. So we talked about before, if you're on the left, you're on the right. If I get left alone with them for like 15 minutes, I can usually get them to agree to transparency, right? I'm like, doesn't matter what your objection is, let's talk. What's interesting, once you open the curtain, is you make it so that we now can go multiple fronts. We're not doing all the eggs in one basket. We're saying, hey, at least we're all dealing with reality now, right? We can see what the biases are. We've had one successful or like meaningful advertiser boycott of Facebook so far. It was called Stop Hate for Profit back in 2020. They got a whole bunch of big advertisers on Facebook to stop their ads for a month. And what ended it was Facebook came out and said, we solved hate speech. We took down like 500 accounts. Like, look at us. Isn't that amazing? But that's because we left them grading their own homework. We let them frame what the relevant questions to ask were. Like, we weren't even allowed to like form our own thesis around like what would sufficient progress look like. And so I totally agree with you. Like, we have really complicated things, but like beginning to allow more people to have opinions is how we go faster. And a big part about what our nonprofit works on is, if you are dealing with technologies that are accelerating, then the only way you're going to be able to handle like how to govern those is if you spend time saying, well, how do we come to consensus faster? How do we get more eyes on this? Because you can progressively keep up if you can exponentially involve more people. You can draw more insights and get more clarity if you have the right framework for organizing that information. And the reason why we're focused on harm taxonomies And those are anchored on, has anyone here heard of Jonathan Haidt? He's like an academic psychologist at NYU. So Jonathan Haidt completely changed the conversation around children's mental health and social media by doing an open literature review. He said, people are throwing at me this quote from this paper. Social media has less impact on childhood mental health than eating potatoes. Like every time he tried to start the conversation, people were like, potatoes, right? It was like smoke bomb, it was over. This is clearly madness. And so he's like, let's start looking at these papers. Let's critique them. Let's see what we know, what we don't know. What are the holes in the studies? Like, what do we need to do next? And it just changed the field. Imagine if we did that on more harms. So we're doing that with 38 harms to kids. So these are initial literature reviews. We're inviting in more people. We're doing 28 harms for national security, everything from foreign interference, which is actually the biggest thing when it comes to misinformation. Your eccentric uncle who has the conspiracy theories, he's not the problem. The problem is information operations that push out memes. And then lastly, we're doing harms of content moderation because we want to show that we are trying to find other solutions than just content. And there's a lot of people who are really, really afraid of being censored. And in reality, it's killing content moderators in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. Right? Facebook took their content moderators out of the United States because too many of them sued them. Right? They looked at too much violent content, too much stuff that hurt them, and they literally got class action lawsuits. And so now those people are in the Philippines and in Africa. And they get way less support than they got before. But we think there's a big opportunity where we don't have places for people who understand social problems to come together with people who understand technology in a structured way. And we think part of why we've never been able to get going, like get inertia on like demands, is because the people who understand social problems don't understand the spectrum of what's available to them technologically. So I'll give you an example. One of the most important levers when it comes to harms to children and families is let's keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms, right? Particularly between 10 and 13, when kids' brains change as they go through puberty, they get more dopamine and oxytocin receptors. They become a lot more attuned to social rewards. That's why none of us in this room will ever get a compliment as sublime as a 13-year-old girl can get. None of us will ever get a criticism as devastating either, so it's a good thing. But let's keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms. And unfortunately, because a lot of the child advocates don't know what's possible, they come out and say, let's check IDs. And the tech companies know that people, particularly in the United States, freak out when you say this phrase. And so one of the things they did to try to stop the age-appropriate design code in California was they're like, we know it's so sad, these kids, but we'll have to check IDs. If you'd gone to a technologist and said, I have this lever, I need to find the under 13-year-olds. I need to keep them off the platform. How do I do this? They'd be like, oh, it's easy. Here's 10 or 15 ways to do this. Kids aren't that bright. They say, I'm a 4th grader at Jones Elementary in their bio. You can find these on Instagram today. They do things like, you were mean to me at recess. I'm reporting your Instagram profile. Because kids are savage, right? Once you find 10,000 kids, you can use AI to find the rest of them. We don't need to check IDs to keep kids off these platforms. But because we don't get to sit around a table and say, this is our menu, what's the floor? We don't get to figure out what we could demand. What we could say is like, I want more. I want this to be better.
Amen, sister.
Yeah.
To quote Frances Haugen in my office earlier, one of my new favoritist people, it's a lot less work to be fatalistic as opposed to let's fix this. Frances Haugen, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful.
You're welcome to hang around, chat to Frances, chat to any of us. Just hug each other if you need after that. Thanks for coming.
The what? Oh, the whole thing. Oh, do people want to end on a happy note?
Oh, yeah. That
If you can
Frances
hear
wanted
me,
to end on an
Can we
uplifting
want to end on a happy note?
Uplifting note. If you
Okay,
need an
ready?
uplifter.
Ready?
Go on.
It'll take 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Okay. So it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. Very reasonable. It's a rational response. Every single communication technology we have ever invented has been incredibly disruptive, right? Like the printing press was actually not that disruptive, right? Because no one could read, right? It's like 3% of Europe could read. And then this crazy monk came along and was like, everyone must learn to read the Bible, right? This is like Luther, and he translates it into German. A whole bunch of people learned to read in a very, very short window of time, right? It goes from like 3% to like 30% of Germany can read. Oh no, now we can also put out pamphlets. And those pamphlets ask questions like, how do you know if your neighbor's a witch? Should you burn them? Spoiler, yes. And it's a huge problem. It becomes incredibly socially disruptive. When we invent the cheap printing press, we see it all over again. This is like newspapers. We literally have wars over misinformation. But we learn. We have developed journalism schools and journalistic standards, media concentration rules. The telegraph, how could the telegraph be disruptive, right? So historians do not say the telegraph caused the Civil War. That's clearly not it. But they do believe it influenced the timing of the Civil War, because for the first time, people long ways apart from each other could find out others didn't actually believe the same thing they did. The world got smaller and that conflict became more immediate. Radio, for the first time, people had personal, emotional, evocative relationships with their leaders. And it played a huge role in the rise of dictators in Europe. But we learned. We came back and we said, let's fund public media. Let's double down on those concentration rules. Make sure there are spaces for different voices. Make sure we have things grounded in the truth. It's overwhelming right now because this new form of media is our burden to figure out, right? This is our moment to shine. And it feels really scary when we're the ones being called on to fix things. But the thing I want to remind you is every single time before we've invented a new form of media, we have learned and we've adapted and we've come out stronger in the end. So I look forward to seeing what the people in this room do to learn and adapt and make a better world. Because I know